In Gainesville, Florida, time stopped on February 9, 1989. A university student walked out for an evening stroll and vanished between one heartbeat and the next. For 25 years, her name echoed through empty woods and unanswered prayers. Her parents refused to let silence win. Then, inside a dead man's prison cell, investigators found something that changed everything. A small black book with dates, numbers, and the chilling proof that some secrets survive even death. What had time buried in the shadows of memory? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. February afternoon light filtered through the Spanish moss as Tiffany Sessions tied her sneakers at the Casablanca East condominiums. The 20-year-old University of Florida student checked her Rolex 4:15 p.m. Perfect timing for her daily power walk. "I'll be back in an hour," she called to her roommate, who barely looked up from her textbooks. Tiffany grabbed her Walkman, the familiar weight of her favorite Aspen sweatshirt comforting against the warm Florida air. She left her wallet, keys, and student ID on the kitchen counter. She wouldn't need them for a quick loop around the neighborhood. The door clicked shut behind her. That simple sound would haunt everyone who loved her for decades to come. Gainesville hummed with its usual late afternoon energy. Students crossed campus paths, joggers nodded in passing, and the February warmth promised spring. Tiffany's routine was as predictable as sunrise, the same route, the same pace, the same quiet determination that had carried her through 2 years of college. At 4:30, she reached the intersection near Archer Road. A few drivers later recalled seeing a young woman matching her description, though none could be certain. The shadows were lengthening, and memory, they would learn, was unreliable. By 5, Tiffany should have been turning toward home. By 5:30, she should have been stretching in her living room. By 6, the first seeds of worry began to sprout in her roommate's mind. The sun set over Gainesville at 6:47 p.m. Tiffany never saw it. The roommate checked her watch again, 9:45 p.m., 3.5 hours past Tiffany's promised return. She had walked every possible route, called friends, checked the library, nothing. Her trembling hands dialed Tiffany's mother in Miami. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it changed everything. "Call the police," Tiffany's mother said, her voice already tight with fear. Now, officers arrived within 20 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of Tiffany's apartment. They found her wallet on the kitchen counter, exactly where she had left it. Her keys hung on their hook. Her student ID lay beside her textbooks, a life interrupted mid-sentence. No signs of struggle, the lead detective noted, scanning the tidy living room. "Front door was unlocked when you returned?" The roommate nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "She never locks it during the day. She always says Gainesville is safe." The detective exchanged a glance with his partner. In 20 years of police work, he had learned that safety was often an illusion, especially for young women walking alone. They dusted for prints, though they found nothing unusual. They cataloged her belongings, noting what was missing: the Walkman, her Rolex, the Aspen sweatshirt she was wearing. Small details that would become crucial evidence in the years ahead. "We'll start searching at first light," the detective promised the roommate. Students sometimes lose track of time, visit friends unexpectedly. There could be a simple explanation. But even as he spoke the words, his gut told him otherwise. 20-year-old college students didn't vanish without a trace unless something terrible had happened. By midnight, Tiffany had been officially classified as a missing person. The clock started ticking on what would become one of Florida's longest cold cases. Dawn broke gray and humid over Gainesville as search teams assembled in the parking lot of Casablanca East. The University of Florida community had mobilized overnight. Students, faculty, and volunteers arrived with coffee, maps, and grim determination. Sheriff's helicopters circled overhead while bloodhounds tracked Tiffany's scent from her apartment to the intersection where it vanished into the chaos of car exhaust and foot traffic. The trail went cold at the edge of Archer Road. "We're treating this as an active missing person case," the lead detective announced to the crowd of volunteers. She was last seen wearing a gray Aspen sweatshirt and carrying a Walkman. "Spread out, stay in groups, and call if you find anything." The search covered 15 square miles. Volunteers combed through palmetto scrub, drainage ditches, and abandoned lots. They checked every dumpster, every culvert, every place a person might hide or be hidden. Local media and public voices arrived by noon, transforming Tiffany's disappearance into a television spectacle. News vans lined University Avenue as reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk about the missing student. "She was always so careful," one classmate told Channel 20. "She had routines, you know. This isn't like her at all." The University of Florida community held its breath. Parents called demanding their daughters come home immediately. Campus security doubled patrols. The carefree atmosphere that had defined college life in Gainesville evaporated overnight. By evening, the search had yielded nothing but false hopes and exhausted volunteers. No Walkman, no gray sweatshirt, no sign that Tiffany Sessions had ever existed outside the memories of those who loved her. The detective stood in the fading light, watching helicopters return to base. Somewhere in this peaceful college town, a young woman had simply vanished. The question was whether she had disappeared by choice or by force. The media frenzy reached its peak on February 11th as national news outlets descended on Gainesville. CNN, ABC, and NBC transformed the University of Florida campus into a staging ground for the biggest missing person story in Florida's recent history. Tiffany's mother and Tiffany's father arrived that morning, their faces etched with the particular anguish reserved for parents of missing children. They stood before cameras and microphones, pleading for information about their daughter. "Tiffany is a responsible young woman," Tiffany's mother said, her voice steady despite her tears. "She calls us every Sunday. She has never disappeared like this. Someone knows something." The University of Florida community organized search parties that stretched from downtown Gainesville to the rural outskirts. Students abandoned classes to comb through forests and fields. The local newspaper published maps showing Tiffany's walking route alongside photos of her smiling face. Media and public voices amplified every lead, no matter how thin. A gas station attendant thought he saw a woman matching Tiffany's description near Interstate 75. A convenience store clerk remembered someone buying cigarettes with a Rolex similar to hers. Each report sent searchers racing across Alachua County, only to find dead ends. Detectives reviewed traffic camera footage from February 9th, but the technology was primitive by later standards. Grainy images showed cars passing near Archer Road around the time of Tiffany's disappearance, but license plates were impossible to read. Fear settled over Gainesville like humidity. Women stopped jogging alone. Parents installed deadbolts and bought pepper spray for their daughters. The town that prided itself on Southern hospitality suddenly felt dangerous. "We have no evidence of foul play," the lead detective told reporters, though his words rang hollow. "But we're treating this as a potential abduction until we know otherwise." By March 1989, hope was dying. The search teams had dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers. The media circus had moved on to fresher tragedies. Tiffany Sessions was becoming another statistic in the growing file of missing persons. Detectives had chased every lead to its conclusion. The woman at the gas station turned out to be someone else entirely. The Rolex at the convenience store belonged to a tourist from Tampa. Psychics called daily with visions and dreams, none of which produced evidence. The case file grew thick with dead ends. Hundreds of tips, dozens of false sightings, and thousands of volunteer hours had yielded nothing but frustration. Tiffany had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. "We're not giving up," the detective assured Tiffany's parents during one of their weekly visits to the sheriff's office. Cold cases sometimes take years to solve. New evidence, new technology, new witnesses, something always breaks eventually. But privately, he was losing hope. Without a body, DNA evidence, or credible witnesses, the case was stalling. The sheriff's department had other crimes to investigate, other families demanding justice. Tiffany's mother and Tiffany's father refused to accept defeat. They hired private investigators, posted rewards, and kept their daughter's story alive through sheer force of will. They appeared on television shows, gave newspaper interviews, and spoke at conferences for families of missing persons. The University of Florida community adapted to its new reality. Security cameras appeared on campus corners. Escort services walked students home after dark. Tiffany's disappearance had changed Gainesville forever, even as the details began to fade from public memory. The case was officially classified as cold in December 1989. The investigation would continue, but with limited resources and fading leads. Tiffany Sessions had joined the ranks of the vanished. Throughout the 1990s, Tiffany's mother became the face of her daughter's case. She wrote letters to governors, petitioned law enforcement agencies, and traveled across Florida speaking about missing persons protocols. In 1995, she published a memoir titled "Where is Tiffany?" The book detailed her family's ordeal and criticized the initial police response to her daughter's disappearance. She argued that crucial hours were lost treating Tiffany as a runaway rather than an abduction victim. "Every minute matters when someone goes missing," she told audiences at conferences and bookstores. "The first 24 hours are critical. and we lost precious time because she was classified as an adult who might have left voluntarily. The book sparked changes in missing person procedures across Florida. Law enforcement agencies began taking disappearances more seriously, regardless of the victim's age or circumstances. Tiffany's legacy was emerging from tragedy. Tiffany's father dealt with grief differently. He spent weekends driving rural roads, searching for signs of his daughter. He studied maps, followed deer trails, and investigated every abandoned building within 50 miles of Gainesville. His obsession worried friends and family, but it also kept hope alive. He carried missing person flyers in his truck and posted them at gas stations across North Florida. Tiffany's face became familiar to truckers and travelers throughout the region. The University of Florida community established the Tiffany Sessions Memorial Safety Program, providing emergency phones across campus and funding safety escorts for students. Each February 9th, vigils remembered the bright young woman who had simply gone for a walk. Media and public voices revisited the case annually, usually on the anniversary of her disappearance. The story had become part of Gainesville folklore, a cautionary tale about trust, safety, and the thin line between routine and tragedy. The new millennium brought advanced DNA technology and renewed hope for cold cases across Florida. Detectives reopened Tiffany's file in 2001, submitting evidence for modern forensic analysis. Hair samples found near her walking route were tested and compared against national databases. Fingerprints lifted from her apartment were enhanced using digital technology. Every piece of physical evidence was re-examined with tools that hadn't existed in 1989. The results were disappointing. The hair samples belonged to various people who had searched the area after Tiffany's disappearance. The fingerprints were too degraded for useful comparison. 12 years of Florida weather had destroyed most forensic opportunities, but the cold case unit refused to surrender. Detective Sarah Martinez inherited Tiffany's file and approached it with fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques. She reviewed every interview, re-examined every lead, and cross-referenced the case with similar disappearances. Cold cases require patience, Detective Martinez explained to Tiffany's parents during a 2003 meeting. Technology keeps advancing, witnesses sometimes remember new details, and criminals occasionally confess. We're not closing this file. The University of Florida community continued its annual remembrances. Students who hadn't been born when Tiffany disappeared learned her story and carried candles through campus each February. Her case had become institutional memory. Tiffany's mother used her advocacy platform to push for legislative changes. She lobbied for faster response times to missing person reports and mandatory DNA testing for violent offenders. Her daughter's disappearance was saving other families from similar ordeals, but the central questions remained unanswered. Where was Tiffany? Who had taken her? And why had a routine walk on a February afternoon ended in vanishment? The case file gathered dust, but the family's determination never wavered. Truth, they believed, was patient but inevitable. Everything changed in October 2013 when investigators cleaning out a deceased inmate's cell at Florida State Prison made an extraordinary discovery. Among the belongings of Paul Eugene Rawls, a convicted murderer and serial sex offender who had died of natural causes, they found a small black address book. The notebook was unremarkable except for its contents, a series of cryptic entries pairing numbers with dates. Most meant nothing to investigators, but one line stopped Detective Martinez cold. February 9, 1989. The exact date Tiffany Sessions had disappeared. Detective Martinez spent sleepless nights studying the notebook. Other entries corresponded to unsolved disappearances across Florida. The pattern was unmistakable. Rawls had been keeping a record of his crimes. "This could be our break," she told the cold case unit supervisor. "But Rawls is dead. We can't question him, and the evidence is still circumstantial." Forensic analysts examined the notebook with meticulous care. The handwriting was confirmed as Rawls's through comparison with prison documents. Ink dating showed the entries were made contemporaneously with the disappearances, not added later. Background investigation revealed Rawls's history, a pattern of violence against women, multiple convictions for abduction and assault, and a documented presence in North Florida during the late 1980s. He had targeted young women in isolated areas, just like Tiffany's walking route. The University of Florida community held its breath as news of the discovery leaked to media and public voices. After 24 years, Tiffany's case was about to take a dramatic turn, but questions remained. Could they prove Rawls was responsible? Would circumstantial evidence be enough to close the case? And most importantly, could this finally bring peace to a family that had waited so long for answers? Detective Martinez worked 16-hour days, reconstructing Paul Eugene Rawles's life during February 1989. Employment records showed he was working for a delivery company with roots throughout Gainesville. His job required him to drive the exact roads where Tiffany Sessions had vanished. More disturbing was what they found about February 9th specifically. Rawles had called in sick that day, the only time he had missed work in 6 months. His supervisor remembered the call because Rawles had seemed nervous and agitated. He said he had food poisoning, the former supervisor told Detective Martinez during a phone interview, but he was back to work the next morning like nothing happened. Always thought that was strange. The cold case unit mapped Rawles's known movements against Tiffany's walking route. His delivery stops placed him within 2 miles of her last confirmed location at the crucial time when she disappeared. Forensic analysts discovered more troubling patterns in Rawles's prison notebook. The FOSSIN 5 lace numbers appeared to correspond with victim characteristics, age, physical description, location of disappearance. Tiffany fit the profile perfectly. He was organized. Detective Martinez explained to her colleagues, this wasn't random violence. He was stalking, planning, documenting. The notebook shows clear premeditation. Prison records revealed that Rawles had boasted to other inmates about crimes he was never charged with. One cellmate remembered him talking about a college girl in Gainesville who had trusted the wrong person. The University of Florida community watched nervously as investigators worked. Students who had grown up hearing Tiffany's story wondered if they were finally about to learn the truth. But Detective Martinez knew that suspicion wasn't proof. They needed more than patterns and coincidences to officially close the case. They needed evidence that would convince a prosecutor, even though Rawles was beyond the reach of earthly justice. The behavioral profile of Paul Eugene Rawles painted a picture of calculated evil. FBI analysts who reviewed his case files described a predator who had perfected his methods over years of violence. His early crimes showed escalation, minor assaults progressing to abduction and murder. By 1989, he had developed a system: identify isolated targets, observe their routines, strike when they were most vulnerable. He was hunting, the FBI behavioral specialist explained during a conference call with the cold case unit, women who walked alone, especially those with predictable schedules. He would study them, learn their patterns, then wait for the perfect opportunity. Tiffany Sessions fit his victim profile exactly. Young, athletic, trustful of her surroundings, and committed to a daily routine that made her movements predictable. She had unknowingly made herself a target. Prison interviews revealed more disturbing details. Rawles had described his crimes with chilling detachment, viewing his victims as objects rather than human beings. He kept trophies from some attacks, jewelry, clothing, personal items that connected him to his violence. The address book wasn't his only record-keeping system. Investigators found letters where he had written cryptically about collecting and hunting season. The language was coded but unmistakably predatory. Media and public voices began calling Rawles Florida's hidden serial killer, though investigators cautioned that the evidence was still being evaluated. The University of Florida community struggled with the possibility that Tiffany's killer had been operating among them without detection. For Tiffany's mother and Tiffany's father, the revelations brought conflicting emotions. Relief that they might finally have answers, mixed with horror at what their daughter had likely endured. After 24 years of uncertainty, the truth was emerging, and it was worse than they had imagined. Detective Martinez and her team spent December 2013 retracing the route Tiffany had walked on that February afternoon 24 years earlier. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. New developments, wider roads, different landmarks. Using archival photographs and county planning records, they reconstructed the 1989 landscape. The path Tiffany had taken was more isolated then, with fewer witnesses and multiple points where someone could have forced her into a vehicle. This wasn't random. Detective Martinez observed, standing at the intersection where Tiffany's trail went cold. He knew her routine. He was waiting. Paul Eugene Rawles's delivery routes from 1989 overlapped perfectly with Tiffany's walking path. Company records showed he had made legitimate deliveries in the area that week, giving him opportunity to observe potential targets. The team used ground-penetrating radar to search areas where Rawles might have disposed of evidence or remains. Wooded lots, construction sites from 1989, and isolated properties along his known routes were systematically examined. Each search yielded disappointment. 24 years of Florida weather and development had erased most traces of that terrible afternoon. If Tiffany's body or personal effects were buried somewhere, they remained hidden. But the circumstantial evidence was mounting. Employment records, the address book, behavioral patterns, and witness statements created a web of connection between Rawls and Tiffany's disappearance. Forensic analysts confirmed that all entries in Rawls's notebook were written with the same pen and ink, eliminating the possibility that he had added Tiffany's information after her case gained notoriety. He had recorded her disappearance in real time. The University of Florida community followed the investigation through local media and public voices. After decades of uncertainty, they were tantalizingly close to answers, but would circumstantial evidence be enough? The cryptic entries in Paul Eugene Rawls's address book began yielding their secrets as forensic analysts decoded his personal system. Each number correlated with victim characteristics, attack methods, and disposal locations for other crimes he had committed. #2, the 9th of February 2089. #2 took on sinister meaning when compared with entries for confirmed victims. The first number appeared to indicate chronological order. Tiffany was his second known victim in what investigators now believed was a serial killing spree spanning several years. The repeated #2 at the end likely referred to her physical characteristics or the nature of her abduction. Cross-referencing with his other crimes suggested he categorized victims by vulnerability and opportunity. Prison psychological evaluations revealed Rawls's obsession with control and documentation. He derived satisfaction not just from the crimes themselves, but from keeping detailed records of his violence. The address book was his private trophy collection. He was reliving the crimes through his notes, a forensic psychologist explained to the cold case unit. This wasn't random notation, it was psychological gratification through memory. Detective Martinez discovered that Rawls had been questioned briefly during the original 1989 investigation. A routine canvass of delivery drivers in the area had included him, but he had provided an alibi that wasn't thoroughly checked at the time. The missed opportunity haunted investigators. If they had looked closer at Rawls 24 years earlier, would other victims have been saved? How many crimes could have been prevented? Media and public voices demanded answers about investigative failures, but Detective Martinez focused on the present. They couldn't change the past, but they could finally give Tiffany's family the truth they deserved. The University of Florida community prepared for what everyone sensed was coming, and this is Ron. Official announcement that would close the longest cold case in Gainesville history. February 5, 2014, marked exactly 25 years and 4 days since Tiffany Sessions had walked out of her apartment for the last time. Sheriff Sadie Darnell chose this date deliberately for the press conference that would change everything. The Alachua County Sheriff's Office press room filled beyond capacity as media and public voices gathered for what promised to be the most significant announcement in the case's history. Tiffany's mother and Tiffany's father sat in the front row, their faces reflecting 25 years of hope and heartbreak. Sheriff Darnell approached the podium with the weight of a quarter-century investigation behind her. The room fell silent as she opened the file containing Paul Eugene Rawls's photograph and criminal history. After extensive investigation and analysis of new evidence, Sheriff Darnell began, her voice steady and clear. "We believe Paul Eugene Rawls is responsible for the abduction and murder of Tiffany Sessions." The words hung in the air like a verdict finally delivered. Cameras captured Tiffany's mother reaching for her husband's hand as 25 years of uncertainty crystallized into terrible knowledge. Sheriff Darnell detailed the evidence, the address book, employment records, behavioral patterns, and the chilling coincidence of Rawls calling in sick on the day Tiffany disappeared. Each fact built upon the others, creating an unshakable foundation of probability. While Mr. Rawls died in 2012 before he could be charged, we are confident in our conclusion, Sheriff Darnell continued. This case will remain officially open pending recovery of physical evidence, but we believe the Sessions family finally has their answer. The University of Florida community watched the press conference with mixed emotions. Relief that the mystery was solved competed with frustration that justice would never be served in as a courtroom. For Tiffany's parents, the moment brought closure without satisfaction. They knew who had killed their daughter, but he would never face trial for his crimes. The aftermath of Sheriff Darnell's announcement rippled through Gainesville and beyond. National media and public voices picked up the story, transforming Tiffany Sessions from a local tragedy into a symbol of cold case persistence. The University of Florida community held vigils and memorial services, finally able to grieve with certainty rather than hope. Students who had grown up with Tiffany's story felt a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Answers had come, but justice remained elusive. Tiffany's mother became a national advocate for cold case investigation funding and missing person protocols. She testified before legislative committees, arguing that every unsolved case deserved the resources that had finally revealed the truth about her daughter. Tiffany's voice was silenced 25 years ago, Shadu Wells told a congressional subcommittee, but her case speaks for thousands of families still waiting for answers. We cannot let budget constraints or time passing prevent justice from being served. Other families of Paul Eugene Rawles's suspected victims contacted the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, hoping that his address book might provide clues about their own missing loved ones. Detective Martinez found herself coordinating with law enforcement agencies across Florida. The state legislature passed the Tiffany Sessions Cold Case Resolution Act, providing additional funding for forensic analysis and investigative resources. Her death had become a catalyst for systemic change. But questions persisted. Rawls had died taking his secrets with him. Tiffany's body had never been recovered. Her family had answers, but no grave to visit, no final resting place where they could say goodbye. Knowing who killed her doesn't bring her back, Tiffany's father said during a quiet moment after the press conference. But at least now we know she didn't just disappear. Someone took her from us, and now everyone knows who. The truth had emerged, but healing would take much longer. In the months following the announcement, investigators continued searching for Tiffany's remains. Advanced ground-penetrating radar surveyed properties connected to Paul Eugene Rawles, hoping to find evidence that had escaped detection for 25 years. The University of Florida community established the Tiffany Sessions Memorial Garden near the spot where her walking route had begun. Students, faculty, and community members contributed to a peaceful space dedicated to her memory and all victims of unsolved crimes. Each search for physical evidence ended in disappointment. Florida's climate and 2 decades of development had likely destroyed or buried any traces of that February afternoon. If Rawls had hidden evidence, he had chosen his locations well. Detective Martinez retired in 2015, but not before ensuring Tiffany's case file was thoroughly documented for future investigators. New technologies might eventually yield breakthrough evidence, and she wanted to make certain nothing would be overlooked. Cases like Tiffany's never really close, she explained to her replacement. We've identified the perpetrator, but until we find physical evidence or recover her remains, there's always hope for more answers. Tiffany's mother continued her advocacy work, traveling across the country to speak about cold case investigations and victims' rights. Her book was updated with new chapters detailing the breakthrough that had identified Rawls as her daughter's killer. Media and public voices revisited the case annually, especially during the February anniversary of Tiffany's disappearance. Her story had become part of true crime folklore, inspiring documentaries and podcast episodes that kept her memory alive. The annual vigils grew larger each year as new students learned about the young woman who had simply gone for a walk and never returned. Candles flickered in the gathering dusk, carrying Tiffany's light forward through time and memory. Contemporary cold case conferences began featuring Tiffany Sessions' investigation as a model of persistence and technological advancement. Detective Martinez and Sheriff Darnell spoke at law enforcement seminars, sharing lessons learned from the 25-year pursuit of justice. Forensic analysts used the case to demonstrate how seemingly minor evidence, like a cryptic address book, could crack cases that appeared hopeless. The techniques developed during the investigation were applied to other cold cases across the southeastern United States. Technology eventually catches up with truth, Sheriff Darnell told audiences at the National Cold Case Conference. Paul Eugene Rawles thought he had gotten away with murder, but time and science proved him wrong. New software algorithms designed to identify burial sites were tested on locations connected to Rawls's known activities. The technology showed promise, but had not yet yielded definitive results in Tiffany's case. The University of Florida community integrated her story into campus safety programs and criminal justice curricula. Students studying forensic science learned about the investigation techniques that had finally identified her killer. Online communities dedicated to cold cases adopted Tiffany's case as an example of how public interest and family advocacy could keep investigations alive. True crime enthusiasts shared information and theories, though most remained respectful of the family's grief. Tiffany's mother appeared on podcasts and documentary programs, always emphasizing that her daughter had been more than just a victim. She had been a vibrant young woman with dreams and ambitions that were cruelly cut short. Media and public voices continued to report on developments in the case, though new information became increasingly rare. The focus shifted from investigation to remembrance and prevention. After 26 years, Tiffany Sessions had become both symbol and memory, representing the thousands of missing persons whose cases remained unsolved. Advanced geospatial technology emerged in 2017 as a potential breakthrough tool for locating long-lost evidence. The University of Florida partnered with the Sheriff's Office to conduct sophisticated drone surveys of areas connected to Paul Eugene Rals's activities. High-resolution LiDAR imaging could detect soil anomalies invisible to traditional ground-penetrating radar. The technology had successfully located burial sites in other cold cases, raising hope that Tiffany's remains might finally be found. Teams surveyed dozens of locations across North Florida construction sites from 1989, wooded areas near Rals's delivery routes, and properties he had access to during the critical time period. Each scan was analyzed by computer algorithms designed to identify disturbances in natural soil patterns. "We're looking for disruptions that occurred approximately 28 years ago," the lead technician explained to Tiffany's parents. "The technology can detect changes in soil density that might indicate buried objects or human remains." One site near Gainesville showed promising anomalies. Ground teams excavated carefully, hoping to uncover evidence that had waited nearly 3 decades to be discovered. The dig lasted 5 days and yielded nothing but rocks and tree roots. The disappointment was crushing but not unexpected. 28 years of Florida weather, root growth, and soil settling had probably erased most traces of any burial site. If Tiffany's remains were buried somewhere, they might never be found. Media and public voices covered each search with renewed hope, but the pattern was always the same: initial optimism, followed by heartbreak. The University of Florida community had learned to temper expectations while maintaining faith in eventual resolution. Tiffany's mother watched each excavation with stoic determination. Finding her daughter's remains would provide closure, but the knowledge of who killed her had already answered the most important question. The discovery of possible bone fragments in a wooded area near Archer Road in late 2018 sent shockwaves through the investigation team. A construction crew unearthing old tree roots found several small pieces of what appeared to be human bone. Detective Sarah Chen, Detective Martinez's successor, rushed the fragments to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. DNA testing would determine if the remains belonged to Tiffany Sessions or some other victim of time and circumstance. "We've learned not to get our hopes up too high," Detective Chen cautioned Tiffany's parents during their notification call. "Bone fragments turn up occasionally during construction projects. Most are from old Native American sites or unrelated cases." The University of Florida community held its breath as testing proceeded. Social media buzzed with speculation about whether the 29-year mystery was finally reaching its conclusion. Forensic analysis revealed the fragments were indeed human, but degraded DNA testing proved inconclusive. The remains were too old and weathered to provide definitive identification. Scientists estimated they had been buried for decades, but could not determine if they belonged to Tiffany. Additional excavation of the site yielded more bone fragments and pieces of fabric that could have been clothing. Nothing was distinctive enough to confirm a connection to Tiffany's case, but nothing ruled it out either. Media and public voices reported the discovery with careful qualification. The possibility of breakthrough competed with the probability of disappointment. Tiffany's case had endured too many false hopes to celebrate prematurely. The inconclusive results added another layer of uncertainty to an already complex case. The fragments were cataloged as potential evidence, but the central questions remained unanswered. Somewhere in Florida, Tiffany Sessions' remains waited for discovery. Time had buried her secrets deeper than any technology could reach. Cold case investigators reviewed every piece of evidence one final time as 2019 marked 30 years since Tiffany Sessions' disappearance. The case file had grown to encompass hundreds of documents, witness statements, and forensic analyses. Detective Chen met with the cold case unit supervisor to assess the current status. Paul Eugene Rals's guilt seemed certain, but proof remained elusive. The address book, employment records, and behavioral patterns created compelling circumstantial evidence, but courtroom proof required more. "In our professional opinion, Ralls abducted and murdered Tiffany Sessions," Detective Chen documented in her final report. "However, without physical evidence connecting him to the crime, the case remains officially unsolved. The University of Florida community had adapted to living with unanswered questions. Tiffany's story was woven into campus culture through safety programs, memorial gardens, and annual remembrance events. Prison interviews revealed that several inmates remembered Rawls bragging about crimes he was never charged with. One cellmate specifically recalled him mentioning a jogger in Gainesville and describing details that matched Tiffany's disappearance. The testimony came too late to prosecute Rawls, but it provided additional confirmation of his involvement. Investigators documented every statement, building a case that would have stood trial if the suspect were still alive. Forensic analysts continued developing new techniques for analyzing degraded evidence. Hair samples from Tiffany's apartment were re-examined using advanced mitochondrial DNA sequencing, but yielded no usable results. Science keeps advancing, Detective Chen assured Tiffany's parents. Methods that don't exist today might solve this case tomorrow. We're not giving up. Media and Public Voices marked the 30th anniversary with retrospective coverage, examining how the case had changed law enforcement procedures and campus safety protocols across Florida. The investigation had evolved from desperate search to methodical analysis to historical documentation. Each phase brought new understanding, but not the final answers everyone sought. The annual vigil on February 9, 2020, drew the largest crowd in the event's history. Current University of Florida students joined alumni who remembered Tiffany from her time on campus. The gathering filled the memorial garden with flickering candles and quiet remembrance. Tiffany's mother, now in her 70s, addressed the crowd with the same dignity she had shown for 3 decades. Her voice carried across the evening air, weaving memory and hope into words that honored her daughter's legacy. Tiffany believed in the goodness of people, she said, standing beside the memorial plaque. She trusted her community, and that trust was betrayed. But your presence here tonight proves that goodness survives even the worst evil. Students who had never heard of Tiffany Sessions before arriving at university listened intently. Her story had become part of their orientation, their safety training, their understanding of why vigilance mattered. The University of Florida community had transformed tragedy into education. Safety escorts, emergency phones, and awareness programs existed because a young woman had vanished during a routine walk 31 years earlier. Detective Chen watched from the crowd's edge, still carrying the case file that defined her career. Active investigations demanded attention, but cold cases haunted investigators differently. They became personal missions that transcended duty. She's still out there, Detective Chen whispered to a colleague. Somewhere in Florida, Tiffany is waiting to be found. Technology will catch up eventually. Media and Public Voices documented the vigil as evidence of community resilience and institutional memory. True crime podcasts featured the case regularly, keeping Tiffany's story alive for new generations. The candles burned late into the night, carrying light forward through time and darkness. Sheriff Sadie Darnell reflected on her career as retirement approached in 2021. The Tiffany Sessions case remained her most significant unsolved investigation, despite identifying the probable perpetrator 7 years earlier. During recorded interviews with Media and Public Voices, Sheriff Darnell acknowledged the limitations of cold case investigation while defending the persistence that had revealed Paul Eugene Rawls's involvement. We gave the family answers, she said from her office overlooking the courthouse, where justice had never been formally served. For Tiffany, not complete answers, not the answers they deserved, but more than they had for 25 years. The case had transformed how Florida law enforcement approached missing person investigations. Response protocols emphasized immediate action rather than waiting periods. DNA databases expanded to include broader categories of evidence. Sheriff Darnell's successor inherited not just ongoing investigations but institutional wisdom accumulated through decades of cold case work. Tiffany's file represented both breakthrough and limitation proof that persistence could identify killers even when prosecution was impossible. Forensic technology continued advancing. Techniques developed for ancient archaeological sites were being adapted for criminal investigations. Ground-penetrating radar could now detect soil disturbances dating back 50 years or more. The science keeps getting better, Sheriff Darnell observed. What seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow. Tiffany's case isn't closed, it's waiting. The University of Florida community honored Sheriff Darnell's retirement with a ceremony in the Memorial Garden. Her dedication to Tiffany's case had sustained hope when evidence seemed hopeless. Students and faculty recognized that cold case investigation required more than technology. It demanded human commitment that outlasted careers and decades. Tiffany's mother spent her later years writing the definitive account of her family's 3-decade search for justice. The expanded memoir included previously unpublished letters, investigation documents, and reflections on how grief transforms over time. People ask if knowing who killed Tiffany brings peace, she wrote in the book's conclusion. The answer is complicated. We have truth without justice, answers without closure. But truth matters, even when it comes too late. The memoir became required reading in victim advocacy programs across the United States. Her transformation from grieving mother to national spokesperson demonstrated how personal tragedy could catalyze systemic change. Tiffany's father had passed away in 2019, never seeing his daughter's remains recovered but knowing who had taken her from their family. His final years were spent supporting other families navigating similar ordeals. The University of Florida community established the Sessions Family Scholarship for students pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice. Tiffany's legacy lived on through those committed to solving mysteries and seeking truth. Media and public voices continued featuring the case in documentaries and podcast series. Each retelling reached new audiences who learned about the young woman whose disappearance had changed how society responds to missing persons. Cold case databases now included Paul Eugene Rawls as a suspect in multiple unsolved disappearances across the southeastern United States. His death had ended his crimes, but not the brought of investigation into their scope. He was evil, Tiffany's mother said during her final television interview. But evil doesn't get the last word. Tiffany's story has saved other families from experiencing what we endured. That gives meaning to our pain. Her voice carried the weight of 32 years, but also the strength of survival. The Alachua County Cold Case Unit maintained Tiffany Sessions' file as an active investigation despite identifying her probable killer 8 years earlier. New technologies and witness statements could still provide breakthrough evidence or recovery of remains. Detective Maria Santos inherited the case in 2022, bringing fresh perspective to evidence that previous investigators had analyzed exhaustively. She approached the file with respect for her predecessor's work while applying contemporary investigative methods. Digital mapping software could now overlay historical data with current geography, revealing locations that might have been significant to Paul Eugene Rawls in 1989. Construction projects from that era were cross-referenced with his delivery routes and work schedules. We're looking at this case with 33 years of accumulated knowledge, Detective Santos explained during a case review meeting. Every advancement in forensic science gives us new ways to examine old evidence. The University of Florida community had evolved beyond Tiffany's tragedy while preserving her memory. Campus safety programs that began in response to her disappearance now served as models for colleges nationwide. Annual enrollment included presentations about Tiffany's case as part of safety orientation. Students learned that awareness and caution weren't paranoia. They were practical responses to real dangers that could emerge from ordinary circumstances. Bone fragments discovered in 2018 remained in forensic storage, awaiting DNA technologies that might eventually provide definitive identification. Scientists estimated that breakthrough techniques could emerge within the next decade. Media and public voices marked each anniversary with updated reports on investigation status and remembrances of Tiffany's impact on campus safety and cold case procedures. The search continued, sustained by institutional commitment and technological hope. Contemporary forensic conferences showcased the Tiffany Sessions case as an example of how persistence and advancing technology could crack seemingly impossible cold cases. Detective Santos presented the investigation timeline to audiences of law enforcement professionals. Her presentations emphasized that Paul Eugene Rawls had been identified through methodical analysis of circumstantial evidence rather than dramatic breakthrough moments. The address book discovery had provided the crucial link, but years of foundational work made recognition possible. Cold cases require patience and systematic approach, Detective Santos told conference attendees. We build understanding gradually, piece by piece, until patterns emerge that reveal truth. The case influenced training protocols for missing person investigations across Florida and beyond. Response procedures emphasized immediate action, comprehensive evidence collection, and long-term investigation commitment. New DNA sequencing methods showed promise for analyzing severely degraded biological material. Bone fragments from archaeological sites centuries old were yielding genetic information that had previously been impossible to extract. Technology is approaching the point where we might be able to extract DNA from evidence that seemed useless 20 years ago, a forensic scientist explained during Santos's presentation. Cases like Tiffany's could benefit from these advances. The University of Florida community continued its annual remembrance traditions while integrating new safety technologies. Emergency notification systems, GPS tracking applications, and enhanced lighting had transformed campus security since 1989. Students learned Tiffany's story not as historical tragedy but as ongoing reality, reminder that safety required vigilance and community support. Her disappearance remained relevant to each new generation. The enduring mystery of Tiffany Sessions' exact fate continued to generate public interest 34 years after her disappearance. True crime enthusiasts analyzed every detail of the case through online forums and social media discussions. Responsible investigators appreciated public attention while cautioning against amateur detective work that might compromise ongoing efforts. The case file remained active precisely because new evidence or witnesses could still emerge. Detective Santos worked with Tiffany's mother to establish guidelines for media coverage and public discussion. Sensationalism was discouraged in favor of factual reporting that respected the family's dignity while keeping the case visible. "We want people to remember Tiffany," her mother said during a 2023 interview. "But we want them to remember her as the bright young woman she was, not just as a victim of violence." The Sessions family had become advocates for other families facing similar ordeals. Their experience navigating decades of uncertainty provided guidance for those beginning their own searches for missing loved ones. Law enforcement agencies consulted them regularly about family liaison procedures and long-term investigation strategies. Their insights had shaped protocols that made the process more humane for other families. The University of Florida community maintained the Memorial Garden as a place of reflection and remembrance. Alumni returned each February to honor not just Tiffany but all victims of unsolved crimes. The site had become sacred space, evidence that memory could transcend loss and that some lights refused to be extinguished by darkness. Detective Santos kept a photograph of young Tiffany Sessions on her desk, smiling and confident, frozen in the moment before evil found her. As 2024 approached, marking 35 years since Tiffany Sessions had walked out of her apartment for the last time, investigators acknowledged both progress and limitation. They knew who had killed her, but not where she rested. Paul Eugene Rolls had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only cryptic notebook entries and the testimonies of fellow inmates who remembered his boasts about crimes that went unpunished. The cold case unit continued applying new technologies as they became available. Artificial intelligence algorithms designed to analyze crime patterns were trained on Rawls's known activities, hoping to identify additional burial sites or evidence disposal locations. "We're using every tool available," Detective Santos assured Tiffany's mother during their regular case updates. Science fiction becomes reality quickly in forensic investigation. What seems impossible today might be routine tomorrow. The University of Florida community had transformed Tiffany's tragedy into institutional wisdom about safety, vigilance, and community responsibility. Her story was woven into campus culture as permanently as the brick and mortar of university buildings. Students who learned about her case often asked why her killer was never prosecuted, providing opportunities to discuss the difference between moral certainty and legal proof, between knowing truth and proving it in court. Media and public voices continued revisiting the case annually, usually focusing on advances in cold case investigation and the family's ongoing advocacy work. Each February 9th, candles flickered in the Memorial Garden as another year passed without final answers. But the light burned steadily, carried forward by those who refused to let Tiffany Sessions be forgotten. Time moved forward, but some mysteries endure across decades, waiting for truth to emerge from shadow. In the quiet hours before dawn, on February 9, 2024, Detective Santos stood alone in the Memorial Garden where candles from the previous evening's vigil had burned down to small pools of wax on the stone pathways. 35 years had passed since a 20-year-old college student had walked out into the Florida afternoon and vanished between one breath and the next. The investigation had identified her killer, brought changes to law enforcement procedures, and provided partial closure to a grieving family. But Tiffany Sessions had never come home. The memorial plaque caught the first light of sunrise, reflecting the inscription that had welcomed thousands of visitors over the decades. In memory of Tiffany Sessions and all those who walked toward light, Detective Santos carried her case file one final time, preparing to pass responsibility to the next generation of investigators. Cold cases required institutional memory that outlasted individual careers, commitment that survived beyond personal involvement. "We'll keep looking," she whispered to the empty garden, words that had been spoken here countless times by parents, investigators, and friends who refused to surrender hope. The University of Florida community would gather again that evening for the 35th anniversary vigil. Students who hadn't been born when Tiffany disappeared would light candles and learn her story. The cycle would continue. Somewhere in Florida, beneath years of accumulated earth and vegetation, evidence waited that might finally bring Tiffany home. Technology advanced each year, bringing new possibilities for discovery and identification. The investigation remained active, sustained by institutional commitment and the enduring belief that truth survives even when justice is delayed. As morning light spread across Gainesville, casting long shadows through the memorial garden, Detective Santos opened Tiffany's case file one final time before transferring it to her successor. 35 years of documentation told the story of a family's determination, a community's resilience, and law enforcement's commitment to truth over convenience. Paul Eugene Rawls had been identified as Tiffany's killer, but the case remained technically unsolved. The file would pass to Detective James Rodriguez, a young investigator who brought fresh eyes and contemporary training to the decades-old mystery. Each generation of detectives had contributed new insights while building on their predecessors' foundation. "Cold cases never really close," Detective Santos explained during the case transfer meeting. "They wait. Evidence degrades, witnesses age, suspects die, but truth is patient. It can survive anything." The University of Florida community continued its daily life around the space where Tiffany's memory lived. Students hurried to classes, faculty conducted research, and visitors paused at the memorial garden to read her story. Her disappearance had changed how the institution thought about safety, community responsibility, and the vulnerability that shadowed even the most ordinary activities. The lessons learned from her tragedy protected each new generation of students. Media and public voices would continue reporting on the case as long as public interest endured. True crime enthusiasts found meaning in Tiffany's story, not sensational entertainment, but sober reminder of how quickly safety could become danger. The sun climbed higher over Gainesville, illuminating the pathways where Tiffany Sessions had once walked, where her footsteps had ended, and where her memory continued forward through time. In the end, some stories resist conclusion. Tiffany Sessions walked out of her apartment on February 9, 1989, and into a mystery that has endured for 35 years. We know who killed her: Paul Eugene Rawls, a predator who documented his crimes in a small black address book found in his prison cell after his death. But knowledge isn't the same as closure. Truth isn't the same as justice. Tiffany's body has never been found. Her killer never faced trial. Her parents lived their remaining years with answers that felt incomplete, closure that remained just beyond reach. Yet her story accomplished something that perhaps matters more than courtroom verdicts. Her disappearance changed how we respond to missing persons, how we think about campus safety, how we support families navigating the unimaginable. Every February 9th, candles burn in a memorial garden where students learn that safety isn't guaranteed and community vigilance isn't optional. Her light continues forward, carried by those who refuse to let her be forgotten. Somewhere in Florida, Tiffany Sessions waits to be found. The investigation remains active, sustained by advancing technology and institutional commitment to truth. Until that final day, when science catches up with mystery, when Earth yields its secrets and Tiffany finally comes home, her story endures reminder that some lights refuse to be extinguished by darkness, that some voices echo across decades, demanding justice that may be delayed but never denied. The search continues. Truth is patient, and memory, like love, survives all attempts at erasure.